proposal. So let me begin by welcoming our speaker and chair of the discussion, Dr. Urjit Patel, Professor Anup Singh. Pratin Roy sir will join in 5 minutes. Mr. Sudhir Srivastava, Professor Abhay Pete, and Mr. Kandar Patel. Dignitaries, Vice President PIC Dr. Vijay Kerkar, PIC trustees, member, and ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed honored to have you with us today, these illustrious personalities, to discuss the recommendations of Chapter 13, Fiscal Architecture of 21st Century India, Fiscal Rules, Financial Management, and Institutions of 15 Finance Commission. Uh, on 9 November 2020, the 15 Finance Commission, led by Chairman N.K. Singh, submitted its report for the period 2021-22 to 2025-26 to Honorable President Ramnath Kovind. Let me give you a brief introduction to our speakers today. Professor Anup Singh was a member of a 15th Finance Commission during the period December 2017 to October 2020. Among his previous positions, he had a long and illustrious career at the International Monetary Fund, IMF. His appointment at the IMF included being director of the Asia Pacific, director of a Western Hemisphere department, and director of special operations in the office of managing director. He was also special advisor to then governor of the Reserve Bank of India, I.G. Patel, and Dr. Manmohan Singh. He has taught at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. as an adjunct professor. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Kandar Patel, former Director, 15 Finance Commission and Director, National Academy of Audit and Accounts, Shimla. Before joining National Academy, he was on a deputation as a Director in the 15 Finance Commission, where he worked closely with the Commission in the areas of public finance and fiscal federalism. He produced a high-quality research and advised the Commission on the tax revenue sharing between center and state, resource mobilization and public financial management reforms. Mr. Patel is a member of a 2012 batch of Indian Audit and Account Service. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Sudhir Srivastava, Chairman, Maharashtra Pollution Control Board. He's an IS officer of batch 1983. He was a Home Secretary, Government of Maharashtra from 2016 to 2018. From 2011 to 2016, he was a Finance Secretary, Government of Maharashtra. Welcome, sir.
Hello. Yeah.
Professor Abhay Pete, Senior Resident Fellow, University of Mumbai. Professor Pete, Distinguished Fellow at Observer Research Foundation, ORF. He served as a professor, Dr. Vibhuti Shukla Chair Unit in Urban Economics and Regional Development, University of Mumbai. Welcome, sir. Let me introduce the Pratin Roy sir also. Like Managing Director, Research and Policy Overseas Department Institute, ODI, was formerly this Director and CEO of a National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, in New Delhi. He has previously worked as an economic diplomat and is the policy advisor at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, with a posting in London, New York, Kathmandu, and Brasilia. He has also served as economic advisor with the 13th Finance Commission, New Delhi, in the rank of the Joint Secretary to the Government of India. Welcome, sir. Today's chairperson is Dr. Urjit Patel, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, RBI, Chairman, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, and member, PIC. After obtaining his PhD, Dr. Patel joined International Monetary Fund in 1990, where worked on the US, India, Bahama, and Myanmar desk till 1995. Thereafter, he went to deputation from the IMF to the Reserve Bank of India, where he played an advisory role in the development of a debt market, banking sector reform, pension fund reforms, and targeting of the real exchange rate. A very warm welcome once again, sir. We are delighted that you could all be here with us today. And now, without any further ado, I hand over to Dr. Patel. Just small announcement. Please send your questions, queries directly to Dr. Patel. So he will be monitoring all the questions. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Dr. Gaikwad, thank you for those generous introductions. Let me also extend my welcome to the 5 panelists. We are particularly fortunate to have Anup Singh, who was the member of the 15th Finance Commission and directly contributed to making suggestions on the subject of India's fiscal architecture, which is Chapter 13 of the main report of the Finance Commission. Uh, Given the conceptual and long-standing importance of the subject, it is the one chapter in the Finance Commission's report where the analysis, rightly so, is not dominated by the long shadow of the pandemic. And that's why it makes it interesting conceptually in a forward-looking manner. We hope to get an understanding from the panelists about the salient proposals that the Finance Commission has made and the motivation thereof. Since some of the proposals, for example, on public financial management process and fiscal council have been made before more than once, it will be interesting to know why these have not seen the light of day, and not only from Professor Anup Singh, but other panelists, most of whom have also been involved with Finance Commission deliberations in the past. Among other questions that perhaps can be addressed by the panel are the following, but not limited to these. On fiscal rules, have we made the notion of second generation rules and inbuilt flexibility, one, basically given undisciplined governments a get out of jail card, and two, by adopting more than one fiscal rule, is the Tinbergen principle of having enough independent instruments being violated? How will the proposals put forward in Chapter 13 of the report elicit more transparency compared to the current situation, where the Comptroller and Auditor General CAG, a powerful constitutional authority, can ask for extensive financial information? Since state governments account for one half of the general government deficit, how will a federal fiscal council be helpful in this regard, or be effective in this regard, even if it comes about? One of the thoughts was that since tying the hands of a sovereign is very difficult, should we just rely on adverse outcomes on account of excessive borrowing to impart pushback, even some sort of punishment? Now, what do I mean by this? One, the attendant crowding out on account of higher government borrowing cost. Two, the consequent potential inflation emanating from excess central bank reserve money creation if recourse to the printing presses is made. And three, impairment of allocative efficiency if financial repression is resorted to, with implications for investment and growth. Let me stop there and start the discussion with the panelists. What I propose is that perhaps in the first round, each of the five panelists, starting with Professor Anup Singh, can speak for 7-8 minutes, and then we can do a mini second round. We have ample time, and then take Q&A at the end. So may I request Professor Anup Singh to start us? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ujit, or I should say, Mr. Governor. It's good to see you, and thanks to Vishal and to Vijay. Okay, as you said, the issues in Chapter 13 and in the report on the architecture have certainly been extensively proposed and written about over the last 20 years. As you said, why haven't they moved forward? Okay, let's look at where India is. We know that our fiscal deficit and our debt are now far away from the FRBM report. The pandemic is forcing a global rethink of fiscal architecture in all countries. And certainly the finance minister, in her last budget just now, announced that a new debt consolidation framework will be done by India very soon. My point is, before we embrace any new fiscal rule or equivalent to the FRBM, we should rethink where are the elements where India lags in its fiscal architecture and see whether those pillars need to be in place before we embrace a new rule. Fiscal rules certainly are an important pillar of the fiscal architecture, but what we say in the Commission report is that they need two other pillars at least to make them work. When they don't work, these other pillars, as the FRBM has not worked, it also distracts from the reality and the need of ensuring that government spending gives you the highest return on government outlays. So clearly what I'm saying is the FRBM rule did not work, no fault of NK, but implementation. The finance minister needs to be highly applauded in her recent budget for making this clear. What I mean is, we have the problem of 3.5 versus 9.5 problem. I won't go into that detail much, but last year, all important advisors and analysts, is the deficit 3.5 or 3.6 or 2.9 or 4.3? And when it was probably close to 6. And now we find out it's 9.5. And is it 9.5 because of the pandemic? And the answer is no, it's not the case. It's because we have rightly brought on the budget off budget. But it's not just the off budget. It's a far broader issue. The 3.5 versus 9.5 is a much broader issue than just subsidies and extra budgetary. So my point is, therefore, India needs specific institutional reforms to anchor these fiscal rules. At all levels of government, markets want to know India's general government, not just central government. So we need these specific reforms also for compliance with efficiency standards and reporting standards, which were also part of the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission. So what I'm saying is that India's fiscal rule, as in the FRBM Revised Act, has not been supported by the institutional framework, resulting in significant gaps in the production, the collation, the coordination, and publication of fiscal data. I think Kandar Patel will go into these details some more. The problem is that a majority of the practices affecting budget formulation, reporting, and execution do not have legislative strength and have built up over time and decades and since independence and the constitution in a number of different ways. India has tried over time to take individual, incremental reforms to successive parts of what are called the public financial management system. These efforts which have been made have generally been standalone, focusing on particular dimensions that have been difficult to integrate and sustain. So the Commission says there is therefore a great need to evolve and agree on a comprehensive public financial management strategy for both the union and the states at all levels of government, recognizing what is needed for policy, regulatory, and institutional reforms. So what I'm saying is the second pillar should be an overarching fiscal framework, probably a legal fiscal framework that would mirror the FRBM Act, define the rules and responsibilities of key stakeholders, and there are many stakeholders here, as well as define the budgeting, accounting, internal control, and order standards to be followed at all levels of government. It should not be that there is a discretionary element at each level of government. So whether spending or the deficit or debt is X, Y, or Z, it should not be open to discretion as to how you report certain accounts. It should be open to consistent application across levels of government. Therefore, the Commission recommends a comprehensive framework with essential elements of public financial management to be prepared and to be discussed by all stakeholders. There are many stakeholders, and therefore it needs to be done in consultation with the states, with the CAG, and other stakeholders. We believe that if such a public financial management framework is implemented, it would give India its second pillar, When I say a public financial management framework, I'm hoping Kamdat may explain more by what I mean. I mean a legal framework. I mean a law. And why? Because that's what most countries who have fiscal rules have is a fiscal legal framework, a PFM law. So the Commission has recommended that a high-level expert group should be established to draft such a legal framework, discuss it, agree on it with all stakeholders, and eventually submit it to Parliament for consultation. It may take 4 or 5 years, but we are now at 75 years where India is. There's a third pillar, which we all know about. I'll speak less about that. It suffers of not having what people have called a fiscal council. Now, fiscal council has been defined in different ways by different commissions and committees over the last 10 years. But the reality is the absence of such a fiscal council, which I think needs to be independent, has diminished the capacity to monitor compliance across levels of government, center and states, of a fiscal rule. So the point is that international evidence tells us there's a high correlation between having a fiscal rule and having a fiscal council. You have a fiscal rule, you don't have the legal framework for PFM, it doesn't work. But also, if you have a fiscal rule, you don't have an independent fiscal council, even a fiscal rule is not going to work because they complement each other in monitoring fiscal policy. Our view is that the fiscal council is needed as a standalone fiscal body or an independent body. It could even be under parliament. It needs powers to access records from the union and the states. It certainly needs to apply its thinking and compliance to center and states. It will have an advisory role, but the importance is it needs to be standalone and independent. And there are many examples across the world of what it could be. So my point is we have the need for three pillars. I think India has one. That one does not work and has not worked and will not work without pillars 2 and 3. So that's my contribution now. That's what the Commission has said. I give it back to you, Vishal. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now request Mr. Kandap Patel?
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen also.
Right.
Yeah, so is this visible?
I can see it.
Yes, yes, it is.
Yeah, so yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for organizing this discussion and inviting us for talking here. So like Professor Anup Singh mentioned, we have in the report, in the 15th Finance Commission report, we have discussed about these three pillars. With the visual, it might become more clear. We are talking about fiscal rules, which will set the institutional and budgetary framework for fiscal sustainability. And then we have PFM system or PFM processes, which will provide for complete, consistent, reliable, and timely reporting of all the indicators which are, which are mandated by the first pillar, which are fiscal rules. And then there is an independent assessment mechanism. It can be fiscal council or any other institution which can come up that can provide assurance and advice on the working of the other two pillars. And we are also discussing that because now we are in an information technology era and we have the data capability, we can use that as a backbone to get the maximum efficiency for all this architecture. So in the first round, I'll mostly talk about the second pillar, which is PFM processes. I think first and third pillar, Professor Anup Singh has already highlighted. I'll go a little bit in detail. What are the gaps identified by the Finance Commission, and some of the recommendations of the Finance Commission where these gaps can be breached. So as we all know, public finance management, the PFM processes, it refers to all the laws, rules, systems, institutions, processes, all that put together that are used to manage public resources, whether to mobilize revenues or for allocation of public spending or accounting for the public spending. So that is the system which is identified as PFM. Now, where are the gaps? I'll just give few examples. So the current PFM system, if we look at India's PFM system, at the highest level, there are constitutional provisions which prescribe or mandate certain things about PFM system. And below constitutional provisions, there are laws, there are rules, orders, manuals, guidelines. I mean, there are multitude of all these things across the government, within the government at different levels. So what has happened is there are some of these practices are very, very old, and we have come to an era which is which requires a different kind of practices, which requires different kind of rules and manuals, but that does not update or change. For example, we have now fiscal rules in place, and we have medium-term expenditure framework, we have medium-term fiscal policy statements. These things are there prescribed in the fiscal rule, but the underlying process of budget formulation, budget preparation, or reporting, those have not changed. So there is some misalignment in terms of our budget processes and what is prescribed under the fiscal rule. Another instance is, for example, in the Central FRBM Act, which was recently amended in 2018, that gives that included a general government debt target at 60% of the GDP, but actually there is no agency which is mandated to compile general government fiscal indicators. So there is again a problem where fiscal rule defines something, but nobody there to compile general government fiscal indicators. If you can't compile, you can't monitor. So then there is some gap there. State deficit and debt, all the state put together is a significant number if you put in the general government debt and deficit. But still there are some gaps in terms of compiling state deficits and state debts. There is also certain inconsistency and practice in the practices across government. For instance, some states report debt only in the consolidated fund as a public debt, whereas some states also include liabilities in the public account as a public debt. So if you combine all public debt numbers, there may be inconsistency across states. So these are some of the examples of some of the gaps which the Commission has identified, and then try to give recommendations based on these gaps. Now, the Finance Commission has identified that for any PFM system, there has to be 4 basic objectives, which are maintaining aggregate fiscal discipline. That is one. Second, strategic budgeting and planning, achieving operational efficiency, and the last but not the least is transparency and accountability mechanism, putting in place transparency and accountability mechanism. So in all these 4 objectives, Commission has identified and recommended certain kind of PFM reforms. I'll not highlight all of them, but a few of them. The first is the coverage. The coverage of all the actors affecting aggregate fiscal discipline is very, very important, be it core government or extra budgetary operations, whether it is through state-owned enterprises or through PPP or any other mode. So all that should be part of the reporting process. only when all that coverage is complete, the underlying risk and extent of fiscal operation will be better known. So that is Commission's one of the recommendation. For strategic budgeting, Commission has recommended multi-year kind of budgeting and multi-year public investment program, specifically for capital investment and infrastructure spending. For operational efficiency part, Commission has recommended to go for Treasury single account for a better cash management system. And thankfully, central government in their budget, the recent budget, they've committed to go for comprehensive TSA. Similar practice can be adopted by states as well, which will improve the cash management efficiency and public spending both. Another area where Commission has also placed a lot of emphasis was on the fiscal accounting, reporting, and making the data available, fiscal data available in the public domain. Commission has also recommended moving towards standard-based accounting, not so much focus on accrual-based, but standard-based. But for this, all the government, state and center will have to come together, probably formulate some fiscal data standards so as to enable the aggregation, disaggregation of information at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. May I now request Sudhir Srivastav? He's on mute.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Patel. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here amongst all of you for this very important discussion. First, since the backdrop is the recommendation of the Finance Commission, I would just like to say that the Finance Commission, successive Finance Commissions have been doing a phenomenal job. I mean, we all know that redistributive questions are highly emotive, very contentious, and really be very scholarly work, full of erudition and wisdom that comes out of Finance Commissions that really makes them widely acceptable, ungrudgingly. So, I mean, even the 15th Finance Commission, I think one of the minefields that they had to navigate, it was the change in the base year of reference population from 71 to 2011. I think the highly emotive, contentious issue, but they have navigated it very, very successfully. So I think we all owe a lot of gratitude to Finance Commissions and members, and especially chairpersons. When we talk of the fiscal landscape, actually, the movement is slow, but it's not as if it has been unchanging. I mean, goods and service tax is a big example. And it's a real big change because states and centers actually allowed a big rebalancing of their taxation powers. But even prior to that, actually, I think one of the deepest reforms was in our pension system. And when we moved away from a defined benefit pension scheme to a defined contribution pension scheme, I actually single it out very specifically because I participated in the entire transition that happened. And I can say that it's not just a technical change that happened, but it actually, in a fundamental manner, it shifted the social compact that underlies fiscal policy. So the fiscal landscape has been changing. Budget making is a pretty technocratic exercise, but beyond that, we also need to remember that budgets, they reflect myriads of conversations that are happening across the society, that they are a result of compromise of various contentions that are there, and sometimes they are resolved amicably, and sometimes I can vouch for it, the resolution is not so amicable. So even when we talk of fiscal architecture and fiscal rules, we need to remember that fiscal policy is conducted in a pretty noisy and contentious backdrop. I think that's something which we always need to remember. So let me look at the first pillar of the fiscal architecture. That's the fiscal rules. And there's been a lot of debate. I recollect we started looking at the FRBM way back in '99. Dr. Kelkar was the finance secretary, and we had the act that was passed that point of time. So there's this question of what should we target, and I think there's been a great deal of debate about that. One is whether we should look at fiscal deficits, whether we should look at debt, whether we should look at primary deficit, whether we should look at revenue balance, or whether we should look at interest to revenue ratio. I mean, these are all some of the parameters that people have talked about. Now, the only thing that I would like to say at this point in time is that whatever we decide upon, I think it's very important that the targets that we select are consistent with the underlying revenue growth and interest rate assumptions that we have. I mean, for example, like if you were to target a fiscal deficit of 3% and your interest rates about 8%, your revenue is growing at about 12%, then this is consistent. I mean, debt will eventually converge. And Dr. Urjit Patel, I think, has worked a lot on this in his earlier years with Professor Buiter. If I recollect, he has written some papers. So debt will converge to 25% of GDP. So if you are targeting a debt to GDP ratio of 20%, then the fiscal deficit that you should really aim at is not 3%, but 2%. So this is something which we really need to remember. Now, there's been some talk that the ideal, the correct parameter to target is the primary balance, and that we should strive to achieve a primary balance. I recently read a pretty influential article. But I think we need to, again, remember that as far as primary balance is concerned, if we were to target a positive primary balance, then if we have a positive growth minus interest differential, then debt eventually will converge to zero. So that's how the long-term dynamics will work out. And even in the short term, we need to remember that if we have we're targeting a positive primary balance, what it means is that the fiscal deficit has to be no more than the interest. And what it means is that if I have been fiscally prudent and I have actually kept a lower debt burden, the interest burden is lower, say 1% of GDP, then the fiscal headspace that I have is just 1%. So I think we need to look at this aspect also. Now, the revenue balance is something which all of us swear by. It's called the golden rule. And the 13th Finance Commission, which Dr. Kelkar headed, actually made it one of the important fiscal rules to be followed by the state government. The central government is above those rules. And we had to face that with pain of certain penalties in terms of debt relief. Here, I think the important thing to remember always is that the government's remit, if you were to look at the theoretical remits of the government, that is in terms of provision of public goods, then law and order, administration of justice, or even if you were to look at merit goods, private merit goods, health, education, or social security nets, or disaster relief, all of these are revenue expenditures. And therefore, if we insist too much on revenue balance, there is a significant under provisioning of these very essential services. In fact, successive finance commissions have also talked about under maintenance of our assets. So this is something which we need to remember. Very interestingly, the data with the 15th Finance Commission collated, it actually shows that the revenue, SOR revenues, states-owned revenues, like they bunch around 7 to 9% of the GDP for the major states, about 9 states. The devolution for the better of states is bunched around 3%, while for the other states, it goes from 8% to 18%. So interestingly, the better off states actually eventually end up having a lower revenue to GDP ratio. And that actually puts a pressure on them as far as maintaining revenue balance is concerned. So here again, actually, I do feel that there should be some additional wriggle room which should be available to some of these states. Otherwise, it does have an impact on services that can be provided. The interest to revenue ratio is one that has also been talked about. Now, if you have a stable interest to revenue ratio, actually what it does is that it allows room for all your other expenditures, and gives them a opportunity to grow at their trend rates. So there is a fair amount of merit in this particular indicator to be targeted. Uh, of course, we need to look at the cyclic nature of output. But there is one very interesting study which we had done way back when it was pre-GST days, and we looked at, of course, we all know that output and tax revenues are very strongly correlated. But interestingly, the output growth and tax growth are not at all robustly correlated. So if you are looking at a GDP growth of 5%, it's not necessary that tax revenues will also immediately collapse, or vice versa. So this is something which we need to keep in mind when we design our escape clauses. And there is one more important thing. I think it is with respect to our need to look at the primary balance. That is we have the fiscal rules, but do we need to supplement it with some rules which actually control the drivers of expenditures, the trajectories of the expenditures? For example, I just mentioned the pension reform that really has changed the trajectory. If you were to look at salaries, for example, you have some autonomous drivers. So you have your annual increments, you have the DA increase that you have to give, or the periodic pay commissions. Now, these are pretty autonomous. And unless you have a handle on these autonomous trajectories of expenditures, the fiscal rules tend to be under great pressure and tend to be breached. So we have seen this happen when it was the fourth pay commission which came, or the fifth pay commission which came in 99. I have seen this in 2008, 2017. Again, we had big pressure on our revenue account as far as this is concerned. So this is something which we need to look at, but that's not so simple. I mean, the rules for the fiscal rules are really technical rules. But the rules which will control the trajectory of expenditures require a huge amount of negotiation, because people really look at budget numbers not just as appropriations that are being put in, but they look at them as entitlements. So that's one thing that we need to look at. On the other two pillars that have been mentioned on the PFMS, I think a lot of things that Mr. Kandar Patel mentioned, in some way or the other, that's happened. I mean, like if you were to look at the treasury single account, that's really a part of the mandate that we have, because the consolidated fund has to be one, and that's part of the treasury manuals only. But I would like to point out why we have this tension. Look, the treasury is controlled by the finance department. It has its own procedures. On the other hand, the line departments, they would like to have a better control over their own expenditures. And this is where this tension comes. Something goes into the consolidated fund, whether it will come back, will it come back in time? Those are the issues which people raise. So we need to keep this in mind, that there is a tension between the goals of the finance department and the goals of the line department. I think when we had this committee on merging, all the flows from the central government, which were going into different bank accounts, different departments, Dr. Rangarajan headed that committee. So this tension was actually very much noted by them, but the committee did recommend that we should actually merge them. But I can say that this is a big tension that we have to keep in mind when we talk of the fiscal architecture. And finally, in terms of the third pillar, the fiscal council or the advisory board, I mean, I can say that every finance secretary would like to have a shoulder to cry on if there's an external shoulder available. But I think if you were to look at institutions set up by an executive fiat or even by a legislative mandate, these can be only as strong as a very strong executive will allow it to be. And therefore, as Dr. Urjit Patel mentioned in the very beginning, whether the CAG, a constitutional body with the ability to access information in a very intrusive, comprehensive manner, is it best placed to do both the implementation, the monitoring of the PFMS part and the monitoring of the fiscal rules? I mean, I mean, going back to the PFMS part, I think the World Bank has a very nice framework, the public expenditure and financial accountability framework with 31 parameters. And I think way back 2008, they did some voluntary work for us. I found it pretty useful. But unless it is accepted across the board by all states, the conversation in these states, like if on a particular parameter a state gets ranking of C, the conversation in the state would be concentrated on the C and not on the A's and B's that the state may get. So you need wide acceptance. And I think the CAG, if they do write reports on state finances, if they could do it, that framework, if they use it, that really, I think, would make states be able to benchmark themselves against the best practices internationally and amongst themselves, and give them an opportunity to improve their performance. So with that, I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sudhir. May I now request Dr. Ratin Roy?
Thank you, Urjit, and thank you to the Pune International Center for having me. I think I've learned a lot already from very wise comments by Mr. Srivastav and Mr. Kandar Patel. I just would like to respond to one of them, and put something into this conversation before I proceed with my own comments, which is, I think we have to recognize that the finance ministry that we have at the center, less so in some states, but definitely at the center, is fundamentally an administrative ministry. It's true of the government of India. These are not places with functional executive capability. And therefore, what they can handle are tasks which are broad in scope and scale, but they're extremely ill-equipped to handle complexity. Example, our virus rollout, virus rollout is going well. Our vaccine rollout is fairly exemplary so far. It's a matter of scale, tika lagao. But to get people to shield, to safeguard, to mask up, and to do anything other than use the administrative artifice of a lockdown is difficult, because complexity is not the strong suit of a government, which is why in the present government, the Home Ministry is a far more efficient ministry than the Finance Ministry. That being said, therefore, my view has turned around to being that not because the executive is strong, actually because the executive is weak. What we need to do is safeguard against the weaknesses of the executive. And one of the reasons I'm a great supporter of inflation targeting, by being fairly cognizant of its faults, is that it provides that sort of safeguard. Because the complexity of inflation management is a difficult task for an administrative ministry to uphold. And I'm not going to go into detail. The same is true, I think, of many, many things to do with public financial management. They may look good on paper, but the moment the complexity goes up, the implementation is poor. I think this report of the 15th Finance Commission recognizes this. They don't say so explicitly, but their careful avoidance of proposing undue complexity leads me to believe that this lesson is internalized. The report, I think, is very comprehensive and analytically very rich. And this is particularly important at this point in time, when there's very little economic analysis going on either in the RBI or in the government of India. We have no medium-term fiscal plan. We have no plan as to how to get out of this COVID situation that is a credible plan that you can place in the public domain. We have assertions, Atmanirbhar Bharat, ye karenge, wo karenge. We have lots of assertions in the future tense. We have a situation where the inflation targeting regime has been rolled over without any discussion whatsoever, or for that matter, analytical justification. So the Finance Commission report, for that reason, with such a poverty of analytics, unprecedented in my view, in the history of India, at the heart of government, actually provides an excellent analysis of central and state finances. I'm impressed that the report does a very reasonable job of acknowledging not just the impact of the pandemic, but also the fact that the prior structural growth slowdown situation was very grave. I remember a presentation by the Chief Economic Advisor, Anup, you will remember this, where I was invited. And the CEA said that, he was giving us certain very frighteningly high numbers of real and nominal growth in the years 23, 24, 25. And I said, Mr. Chief Economic Advisor, on what basis do you say this? He said, well, we are planning these reforms, and these reforms will bring this payback. So I said, well, then you found the magic bullet. And you should say so. You're going to fundamentally change the course and direction of economy, of the trajectory of the Indian economy through these reforms. But there is nothing else. And the Finance Commission, I note, did not take that on board. Their projections are fairly cautious. They also take account of a reality which Mr. Srivastava was referring to, which is by no means unique in the world. It is peculiar to India and to some extent South Asia, which is that if you look at the record of revenue collection from 1991 to 2019, pre-pandemic, the revenue GDP ratio, general government, is actually a little bit lower than it was in 1991. The consequence of that, since expenditure has gone up, has tried to go up, is that when borrowing constraints have been imposed on the government of India, the size of central government spending has actually shrunk since 1991 from approximately 19% of GDP to now 12-13%. This is pre-pandemic. So you have a shrinking central government with a growing economy. And in those circumstances, fiscal consolidation will have to take account of the fact that both revenue and resource mobilization on current track record are unlikely to be parametrically very different from what they have been across the past 30 years. And this is foundational, I think, in the analysis of the Finance Commission, for which I really do commend them. It's a fantastic analysis as a baseline on which to proceed, and they have set the marker there. It takes away all the fluff and bluster of promises of rises in the tax GDP ratio that many people have been recommending without cause. I remember my friend Sujit Bhalla predicting that in 18-19 buoyancies would be more than 2 tax buoyancies. Quite the opposite has happened. And the Finance Commission has very soberly taken this into account. And I do know that that's had a very sobering impact on how the Ministry of Finance is looking at the forward trajectory. It's been a very good reality check. I think that this commission was presented with a ridiculous terms of reference, ridiculously biased, flatulent, and inappropriate for a finance commission. Examples. It was asked to develop measurable performance indicators to see how and to what extent states are implementing central schemes. I cannot think of a more flagrant violation of the spirit of federalism than to accuse states, going further, of engaging in populist expenditure when the landscape of central government expenditure is littered with populism. I think the Commission has been very clever. They have recommended performance grants which have very little to do with the implementation of state schemes effectively, etc., while taking on board the language of the center, such as Atmanirbhar Bharat, Matrabhasha development, etc., etc. So this genuflects to GOI's desire that public resources be used to align state governments to central priorities, but does not compel state governments to undertake such an alignment. The work that they have done on population, as Mr. Srivastava was saying, is exemplary. I did my own analysis after the commission report came out, and I assure you, if you had tinkered with those two population parameters, 71 and the contemporary one, the fertility parameter and the absolute population parameter, even by 2% this way or that, you would have many states complaining. So they walked what Joan Robinson used to call a knife-edge path on the thorny population question. It's an act of great analytical skill. I commend it to all economic students to rework those estimates and see what I'm saying. A sensitivity analysis will show you that they had very little room and they executed it beautifully. The other thing they did, which I think is very important, is protected the integrity of the Indian public the public finance system. This steward, this insidious steward, had also asked the Commission to consider, and I quote, whether a separate mechanism for defense and internal security ought to be set up. That in effect would have amounted to sequestering public revenues for certain purposes that are in the core remit of the central government. And in effect, that could only be done either by fracturing the central government budget or by sequestering money from the divisible pool, that is implicitly cutting money from the states to pay for defense. The Commission wrote some excellent English on this matter. and in the end recommended a non-lapsable fund, which means absolutely nothing, as Mr. Patel will tell you. All fiscal resources are non-lapsable. It only remains for you to say that you will spend as much as you did last year or more or less, should you have spent less than what you said you would spend the previous year. So creating a non-lapsable fund is a brilliant mechanism to give the fig leaf of earmarking, which any public finance person knows, earmarking is always a fig leaf. And the Commission, I think, did so very, very well. So I'm being very fulsome in praise for very good reason. These are excellent things to have done in the face of a ridiculous TOR. Now, what the Commission did not do was tackle the problem of cesses. Now, let me start by saying to the audience, it's very easy for me to say this. I have advised the 13th Finance Commission, sitting outside a Finance Commission. In practice, when you're in a Finance Commission, I know it is difficult, but now that I'm a free bird and in academic space, the argument that they could have done nothing does not quite wash. They could have done something for the record. I understand it is difficult to do that caveat. This is what they could have done. They could have said that the vertical devolution will be a function of the total proportion of cesses in total revenues. And the higher the proportion of cesses, the greater will be the lower will be the vertical devolution, thereby protecting the overall vertical devolution. Now, it is another matter whether the center would have accepted this. They haven't accepted most of the Commission's report, by the way, just the integral parts. And that, of course, the Commission must have applied its judgment, but it remains for me to point out that it is not true that it was technically infeasible to deal with the problem of cess. This is an unsavory practice, and the Commission has done well to highlight it, as their previous commissions. They have also been very courageous and actually said that the resort to cesses will increase over time. They've tried to limit it in the sense that the trend line is lower than it was over the last 10 years, but they could have technically done more. Penultimately, on fiscal consolidation, we've had some discussion, and I find it quite interesting that the recommendations on fiscal consolidation are very brief, almost, I would say, shy. There is no innovative thinking that could have been there that captures the global discussion, which I'm very much part of now, which is speaking of reassessing the entire framework for fiscal responsibility and an increasing acceptance, in my view, that the accountant's view of debt sustainability should be replaced by an assessment of what debt is used for rather than how much debt is undertaken. Perhaps that is because we have, as I said, an administrative government. And this is a question of great complexity, which it is unfair to burden a government without the competence to undertake such an assessment to do. Nevertheless, it is the case that such an assessment is happening. The how and the what are becoming important. And this is not as simple as the quality of public expenditure. There are many India-specific points to this, which Mr. Srivastava raised, which are of great importance regarding committed expenditure, what happens with revenue expenditure, etc. Those have been absent. My other criticism is the Commission provides 3 alternative fiscal deficit scenarios, which allow for more borrowing the slower is macroeconomic recovery. I would submit, compared to the Commission's medium-term assessment, I would submit that this is a rather, if I may say so, Anu, irresponsible exercise in humility. If the Commission's macroeconomic estimates are feasible and achievable, then the logic for a range escapes me. And since there is an assessment, which is a polar assessment, and if that assessment is a credible assessment, then surely we should be building any targets regarding fiscal responsibility and the fiscal deficit based on that assessment. And it is then the government's job to try and see how it does it if circumstances are less or more favorable. For the rest, what the Commission's report says is honest. Revenue expenditure will continue to be financed out of borrowing in large measure. That is very clear in the Commission's report. At the moment, that ratio is about 72%. 72% of borrowing is not used for capital expenditure by the central government. The Commission expects that to modestly decrease, but have not made any grandiose assumptions that it will decrease in sharp measure at the central government level. There will be no large improvement in revenue mobilization, even if GDP grows as forecast. And the government's claims on disinvestment have been, I think, very rightly taken very, very skeptically, given its track record, the central government's. So even without the ranges, that means a higher fiscal deficit glide path, arithmetically. And that is exactly what the Commission has done. I think that is excellent. I think that is honest. I think that is analytically well-grounded, and it resists the contemporary temptation to engage in fantasies in the future tense. Finally, I think the report's recommendations regarding the future fiscal architecture have been presented with wistful brevity. And here I think with appropriate humility, acknowledging that these have been recommendations that several entities have made in the past. And in a sense, the Commission almost seems to recognize that the governments of India's willingness to undertake more than cosmetic changes in the instrumentation of fiscal architecture for the past 30 years does not bode well or give us confidence that you will see anything more than cosmetic changes in the future, because there is no compelling reason for the government of India to undertake anything non-cosmetic. The fact that decision-making remains ad hoc, which has been proven after the report, witness the complete lack of discussion on the parameters of the inflation targeting rollover. I could go on and on. So this low executive and analytical capability has been recognized by the Commission, and therefore the Commission, I think, has chosen, and I know they've been criticized for it, I think unfairly, to tread extremely softly and sympathetically, and to provide the government with options to undertake low levels of fiscal reform, and have pointed out that if the ambition were there, then higher levels of fiscal reform were perhaps possible. I think this recognition of the reality of the competence and capability of the finance function in the central government in the year 2020 was very, very important. It is something the private sector ignores. It is something the economists tend to wish away. And therefore, their ask from this rather decrepit architecture that we have inherited, without any political incentive or capital to change it, is very often not in consonance with reality. So I think the Finance Commission's recommendations are in consonance with reality and leave a door open, should there be political capital to be invested going forward in fiscal consolidation, for that to happen with an appropriate roadmap. So I don't know what you make of what I've said, but I'll summarize what I've said. I think it's an excellent report that takes account of contemporary realities. There are some things that I would have done differently.
I think we need to stop you now because...
Yeah, I'm just finishing. So, and I would conclude by saying that, therefore, I think if you wanted a more reality, you could not have had a more reality-based report of such excellent quality than we have seen here. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now invite Professor Patel, please.
Thank you very much. And again, like Ratin, I must say I learned a lot, and my job actually is done being part of this particular program. But since I'm on the panel, I'll take up a little bit of time. Urjit, how much time do I have?
About 8-9 minutes.
Okay, I thought you were going to cut down my time because
no,
whatever. All right. So since I'm speaking last, there are a lot of things that have been said which I won't repeat. But first thing is that this particular chapter is very important. The political landscape has changed over a period of time. And the reason why I mentioned the political landscape changing is that the discussion should not be confined to administrative or technocratic stuff, but it needed to be grounded more realistically in the political economy and the political reality that we have. And that, to my mind, has not happened in this brief report. Not a criticism, just a comment. Because the centripetal bias has changed completely. And we are no more a union with the centripetal bias. The coalitional, the regional parties, regional governments that have come up, each very powerful, has changed the landscape. And we need a different fiscal relook at the fiscal architecture. Having said that, let me start by saying, being a professor, let me bring in a couple of questions which really, I don't know whether they are relevant, but I'll nevertheless pose them. One is, for the requisite design of an implementation, is there a sufficient recognition that has been paid by these, by this particular chapter in particular, but overall the Finance Commission, to the state capacity available with us currently? Because most of the things that you've said are logical, and one doesn't have any comment or any controversy or anything like that. The second is, and this is important to what Anup had said in the beginning, do simple rules suffice to tackle complex issues? You've gone for simple, clean codification. In my experience, complex situations do not admit of codification to the end. And ultimately, if we are placing it within the political economy, then the rigidity and the constraints of numbers and rules will not work, as it should not in a participatory political democracy. Who are we wise people to do this and tell the political masters that you have to be bound by that? We can advise them, we can guide them, but ultimately it's the maturity of the polity that is supposed to work. And that is firmly going to be the thing that we need to remember. The tightening of the second thing, the third question is, the fiscal compact of any kind requires us to sustain a cooperative federal structure going forward. I don't believe in Ratin's competitive federalism and all that. That's okay, you're saying you don't mean that, but whatever. So only way is cooperative federal structure. And if we have a cooperative federal structure, then trust and credibility become very important. Do we have that today? If not, that's another thing that we need to work on as a backdrop if we want to do all the things that are very nicely said that we need to do. Now, the fleshing out of this is very important, and Kandar, of course, explained it very lucidly also. The aggregate fiscal, this is the four things that he talked about in the PFM framework, which Sudhirji also talked about. The aggregate fiscal discipline, strategic budgeting planning, operational efficiency, and accountability and transparency. And they've explained that very well. I think the emphasis I would have put slightly differently, because the PFM, the processes, the IT leveraging is all fine. That's technocratic, will be done, could be done. My problem working with a little bit, not anything like what you people have, but with the government is that the capacity of people at the slightly lower than IAS levels is so horrendously low from where the files come up, that when you get the vision, there is no vision of the budget to begin with, and the vision or the strategic vision for budget making requires a major capacity building and handholding at all levels. Not the way mechanically we put together the budgets as we do, as most of you would agree. So you require technical expertise for macroeconomic forecasts and so on. And it is said that it should be within the domain of Finance Commission. I think we have already burdened Finance Commission with a lot. Ratin mentioned a little bit of it. And I think Finance Commission, which is a dissolving thing, should not be burdened with these kinds of things. We should much rather go for some other institution, because there might be at least continuity there. So the fundamental reform in budget making process is absolutely important, because other than that, the performance orientation, outcome budgeting has been there. We've been talking about it. What is the problem? The problem is A, capacity, and B, political will. Both of that. Political will come when it comes to transparency and accountability also. Of course, you can say that if ultimately you don't assume any political will, then we might as well pack our bag and we don't need to do all the things that we're doing. And that's not my point. I am a hopeless optimist. So within this, we will have to find some kind of a way of keeping in mind perfectly well that we are not in the first best world. So when we make policies and prescribe policies, please get the second best world that is there, which we have, and try to push forward. And Ratin's compliments were actually to the Finance Commission for doing that, and that is great. Now, there is this talk about metadata compilation, because ultimately we can't create any kind of sensible policy without empirical evidence or data, and that data is simply not there. So the effort that you are making, and best of luck to that, with all kinds of consultations that you propose, we need to have this. But again, CAG is not the people to do that. You will need somebody else. And although I think there are books written, and I've read one saying that not just an accountant and all that, I think it's best that we have them to be just accountants and not get into policy spheres, which is not what they should be talking about. That's where political masters and helped by bureaucracy and some of the experts outside should be helping. So whereas PFM is terribly important, the very template on which it is built, which is the budget, which is the soul of it, needs a fundamental reform. Otherwise, see what is happening to the gender and the child sensitive budgeting that we have been, maybe make it a possibility and we create a horizontal table post facto and create a gender budget. Now, that's not the way to do it. All of us know that. So we need to work at this. And I wish that you would have, with all your expertise, spend more time on capacity building and how to do it, which is, I think, the major problem with us. I think the international best practice, and all of you have talked about it, I'm all for a fiscal council, especially when you had a monetary council, although it may not have anything to do with the thing and might not have the same kind of a thing, just for balancing, just for optics. We need to have it. Will it be ultimately executive will allow it to function? Who will be manning it? All right, all these problems are there. But let's have it. With the social media, with the powerful media that we have, if we have a independent, I am not even saying independent, quasi-independent authority, which does these kinds of things. And I would, for example, it's supposed to be put under Parliament. I would say put it under NIPFP, you know, and let them have a cell or a department or something like that, and let them have a fight with the government a little bit and not be too cozy, although they would be working with the finance ministry. So I think that's a great idea and it should happen. Let's not bother about what's the best way of going about doing it. Let's begin with it. Let us get some heads there. Let them start throwing out some numbers. Government may or may not take any cognizance of it, but ultimately media, social media, some people who read might do something about it and it will become important. Now, the final 3 points that I have. Although the chapter is on fiscal architecture, it is actually about fleshing out of elements of architecture, rather than looking at changing, revamping the architecture itself. Again, not a criticism, but just a comment. And the problem that I will repeat the third time is that of capacity building. Whatever you suggest, second best and capacity building, please, and political economy, not trying to over codify, is the way. Don't use, even your language should be different and, you know, not that of an accountant. Let's have a language which is more political economy language, and let's have that kind of stuff. Now, let me put in the second penultimate point, and that is, since Anup Singh ji talked about 3 pillars, let me talk of 4 pillars in a small piece that we had written, Dr. Kelkar and me, in some newspaper. We had said that India's fiscal federal architecture, there are 4 pillars that would serve going forward. Number 1, the Finance Commission, which is doing a stellar job despite everything, and everyone has complimented the Finance Commissions and this particular one, and I will just join with that. The second is Niti Aayog in all this. Only Niti Aayog must stop being the empty box that it is, or a think tank if you like to call it, and have it, give it some teeth with some resources so that it can perform the important task of equilibrating horizontal imbalance between states arising out of infrastructural or capex component. which is not the job of the Finance Commission to do, and no one is there currently to do it after we have dismantled Planning Commission. The third is again, of course, the pet horse of my mentor, Dr. Kelkar, flawless GST, which would get the grand bargain going for the states and so on. And fourth, decentralization, which is my last point. The structural view, I think one of the big things that has happened, everyone talked about what they thought, was the 73rd, 74th constitutional amendments. When you talk of the government, legacy overhang has meant that states consider these local bodies as their own creatures. Actually, there is a constitutional validity for them. We need to push for it. India is now definitely a 2+ federal system. And if it is so, then we need to work on it. And that is where the decentralization aspect, the aspect of the local bodies and working at their accounts and so on is very, very important. And that should have found a place in this particular chapter also, rather than having too much of mention of center and states. Even optically and strategically, it would have been better to bring in a third party along. It's always a different game when it's a 2-person rather than a 3-person. 3-person makes it an entirely different ball game. So let's get them in, and they should have, which they haven't. I'm sure I'm coming just now from a webinar where I was discussing chapter 7 of the Finance Commission, where in that they have mentioned a lot of things that they want. In fact, they have gone overboard and I believe asked for conditionalities from local bodies like audited accounts and so on as an entry-level thing, which warms the cockles of my heart as an academic. But I don't think anyone will become eligible that way, and all the money will remain with the central government. That's jokes apart. They've done that there. There they've talked of accounts and so on. They should have talked of that. Ideally, they would create this metadata system. Thank you very much. And Urjit, all yours.
Thank you, Professor Pate. We've all been very good with the time, so we still have about 15 minutes. I see a few polite greetings in the chat box, but no question as such. Just now something came up. Let me put it out there. It's more a comment, and any of the participants, any of the panelists can add. It's from a person called Nitya. He says that to add to the need for a fiscal council at the union level, that council must not substitute the need for a body at the state level, a state-specific fiscal council, which makes state budgets more analytical monitors. What are your thoughts on this? Who would like to take that? Yes, Anu, please. Thank you.
Just one sentence only. I agree. However, a state council can, for a while, look at states too, and should. But more importantly, no one so far talked about the absence of state finance commissions. So constitutionally, they should be there. They are effectively not there. This is a huge drawback in terms of thinking and implementation at the state and local body level. Why don't we push the State Finance Commission to act? And why don't we push the states to act, which is why the commissions are not acting?
Thank you, Anup. That's a fine point that you have made, that perhaps the gap is the absence of the State Finance Commission, which then dovetails with the work of the main Finance Commission, and perhaps that's where the continuity and the multi-year budgeting and expenditure plans can all come together in a consistent manner. Anyone else wants to have a comment on the?
If I may just very quickly, but actually not so much the original question, but to what Anup was saying, because I just spent 5 minutes, 10 minutes talking on this in that other webinar, where I said that state finance commissions are treated farcically. See, I was a member of the 5th State Finance Commission of Maharashtra, and I was forced to write a sentence saying that, listen, there is no data that is being given to us by the state. There is no data available to us. We are not in a position to do any formulaic devolution. And we hope that you at least do that. And that is where what these people have said of creating a good data system is important. Because without that, we are not in a position to function. So we said at least the future state finance commissions, and what this state finance commission has done, has at least said that at an entry level, you must do it by 24. But I think they should have done slightly more than doing that. I don't know what, but making somebody ultimately, they must believe. Most states believe that the local bodies are just their own creatures and they don't have any constitutional validity. That is where the problem is. Otherwise, of course, having local state level councils will be very good. My problem is that let's have central state council first, because state level the capacity and the politics is slightly different and difficult. My feeling is that at the center, it might be easier to do than the state. But if you started it all over, it will be a mess and it will fail. So it's best to do only at the center. Ultimately, there will be branches at the state level. And thank you.
Sudhir, you had wanted to say something? You are muted. You are muted.
Yeah. See, I just wanted to respond to something Dr. Ratin Roy said. That's about the tax GSDP ratio. Actually, I know that the Finance Commission worked on that, and they felt that because compared to OECD, we have a lower tax to GDP ratio, and there's a tax gap of as much as 5%. But also there is this chapter in the Economic Survey 1516 entirely devoted to it, and where the tax GSDP ratio for different countries been regressed on per capita GDP. And there actually India stands, firmly on the trend lines. So we need to, I think, keep that in mind also. And related to it is another issue, which I think, I don't know how does the taxation policy actually impact savings and growth. So that is also something which we need to really think about. There is some old paper that I was looking at, where they regress some data for OECD countries only, but firmly, unambiguously found that the savings, private savings, they are negatively correlated with tax GDP ratio overall, and also direct and indirect. So I think this is something which we need to keep in mind. What is the implication of a high tax to GDP ratio if you target it on growth, savings? Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir. Someone had mentioned, because I don't see any more questions, someone had mentioned about the trust between the center and the states for many of these things. I think that in part, more giving up of powers and devolution on qualitative matters will depend on how the GST Council is perceived to have worked amongst the states and between the center and the states. If anyone would like to comment on that, there is a question now that has come up. It says that the committee addressing issues in the regional imbalance in Maharashtra under Dr. Kelkar had recommended that the state should set up a statistical board. It has not been acted upon as yet. So I think Professor Pate's comment on the lack of data, even the framework to get data in the future has not been initiated upon. So that really is a sad state. I don't know what else to say except that if a state like Maharashtra, which actually has a lot of capacity compared to most other places, if we don't do this, we really do have a problem. Any other comments? And that we still have about 5 minutes.
If I may come in briefly,
Mr. Kandap Patel. Yeah, Mr. Kandap Patel, then I'll come to you, Ratin.
Yeah. Thank you. Just response to a couple of comments. One was on the role of CAG, and here I'm not giving institutional view or as a representative of CAG, but my personal view is CAG as an institution does most of the accounting work as well as post-audit work. And what we were suggesting in the Finance Commission report, the role of Fiscal Council is more ex ante role than the post facto role. So I think CAG's institution, and probably they'll have to, I mean, if at all that role goes to CAG, there has to be some kind of innovation or something they'll have to do, because it's a completely different role, which CAG currently probably is not geared up to do. That was one. Second, on the comment that fiscal policy is made in a very noisy environment, there again, probably Fiscal Council kind of a setup can take some of that noise away and do the technocratic exercise, and the political economy or the political side can take from there onwards. So it was like creating a cushion between the noise and the technocratic exercise. And lastly, kind of a concluding remark, in the chapter on the fiscal architecture, our focus is mainly, of course, central government is there, but we are also trying to focus on states, bringing these small PFM reforms, because central government is generally under very high scrutiny. The budget gets discussed, some of the processes gets discussed, but 2/3 of public expenditure in India is at the subnational level. So the focus in the PFM reforms at the state level are very, very essential. That was one. And the second part, somebody mentioned credibility also, the credibility of fiscal policy. Now, if the PFM processes are strong and the institutions like Fiscal Council is strong enough, then it also gives a lot of credibility to the fiscal policy. And once you have credible policy, the macroeconomic, it can also favor some kind of macroeconomic conditions. It improves market confidence. And in turn, again, it helps the fiscal sustainability of the government. So that is where we were trying to focus in the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kandab. Excellent points. Ratin?
No, I just wanted to respond to what Mr. Srivastav said. You see, this business of writing cross-country regressions at a point in time is not how the history of tax policy has worked. Basically, what has happened is that what normally happens is if you're a low-income country, you have a low tax GDP ratio. And if you triple in 30 years, your per capita, the size of your economy, and more than double your per capita GDP, unless you're a very unequal economy, you would expect to see a rise in the tax GDP ratio. That will not be captured by a point-in-time estimate. I don't know why Arvind did that. And in India's case, remember, in 1990, when I'm saying that the size of the state has shrunk, what does it mean? And the tax GDP ratio today is lower than it was in 91. It means essentially you're paying people to spend more. Who do you borrow from? Rich people. So what you're seeing is a fundamentally unequalizing process. That is one. Second is, since 2015-16, the tax GDP ratio has fallen. So even if you say that India is in the same asset class, 4 years of continuous decline in the tax GDP ratio is a matter for great concern. And therefore, I think the Finance Commission is absolutely right to be pessimistic about our future trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on the last point, Ratin, I think that it's not that much of a mystery why our tax GDP ratio does not increase. I mean, every few years, we do give away freebies. I mean, in the run-up to the 2019 election, everyone below 5 lakh rupees income pays no income tax in India. Absolutely. 5 lakh rupees is 3 times the average per capita GDP. So, it's something that we knowingly do, and that's where we are. Anyway, that's we have one more minute if anyone wants to say something. Otherwise, I will thank all the panelists. Anup Singh joining us all the way from Washington. Kandap Patel, Sudhir Srivastav, Ratin Roy, Professor Abhay Pete. I think I certainly enjoyed the conversation and listening to five great panelists, and I suspect that so did the audience. And Vishal, thank you for ensuring that the technology and the backup worked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Good. Right. Bye. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so we announced that event is over. Thank you very much. Just a small word of thanks to all our panelists and chairman of today's event, Dr. Ujit Patel, and also a special thanks to Dr. Vijay Kerkar, Vice President, for continuous engagement and with encouragement, because without your support and guidance, this event could have not possible. A special round of applause for our PIC staff for their untiring efforts and for the planning that you put behind every event. Thank you very much. And we have now come to the end of today's program. Thank you, and have a great evening ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.